Hey guys, this is Joey Bombaci here, and I am with
Ryan Nicely.
Today we're going to be talking about Raking Muck for our CSI APUSH history project. Today we're talking about Ida Tarbell in the oil industry with Standard Oil versus Michael Moore in the auto industry dealing with GM and his 1989 film Roger and Me. This project is by Joey Bombaci, Ryan Nicely, and Alex Dominguez. Video courtesy of Nick Johnson. Michael Moore, born April 3rd in 1954, is a Flint, Michigan native. He grew up in Flint his whole entire life, and he has felt a strong connection to that place his whole entire life, so he loves the town, he loves the people. In Flint, Michigan, in the early 1980s, it was home to General Motors, in which GM housed thousands of jobs that were just a major part of Flint's economy. But in the late 1980s, GM was having some problems with their cars. They were building cars that just were both economically and environmentally unattractive to their consumers. And so they started to lay off people to make up for the money that they were losing. And Michael Moore ended up creating a film called Roger and Me, in which there was much controversy and many later interviews about the subject. In one interview with Larry King on November 20th, 2008, Michael Moore said this, on quote, about his own town of Flint. "Today I think there is less than 12,000 people working in that area, so it has completely devastated Flint, and Flint was one of the first towns to go in the local areas where GM provided economic support." And economically speaking, Moore states that GM as well as Ford and Chrysler were losing money because they, again, were not building cars that were economically and environmentally attractive to consumers. Moore is also on quote of saying, "Eventually the consumer got smart and said, I would like a car that gets better gas mileage, and I would like a car that is safer on the road. So they started to buy other cars, and GM, again, still would not change their design. They still kept building cars that were unattractive, and more people stopped buying them." In 1989, Michael Moore released his film Roger and Me, and it was a representation of the decline of the economy in 1989 in Flint, Michigan. Moore also states in his 2008 interview with Larry King, when he made the movie 20 years ago, he hoped that the film would be a warning to other cities that this corporation was intent upon removing jobs from people in this country and giving them to people in Mexico and Brazil and GM's other manufacturing sites. As far as the public opinion goes, Rotten Tomatoes, a world-renowned movie review website, stated that on a global scale, Moore's film received an 8.8 out of 10 for an average rating, and on the audience review, 79% of people liked the film. As far as Biography.com goes, the Biography Channel website talked of this public opinion, and they explained that the Washington Post described Roger and Me as a quote-unquote hilariously cranky bit of propaganda. They also continued to go into detail on how critics gave it rave reviews and just tons of positive feedback. However, you will always have your negative critics out there, and those critics such as Paula Kael from The New Yorker and many others attacked Moore for so-called rearranging the narrative events of the movie. Moore responded to the film in yet another interview titled The Film Comment, and he said, quote-unquote, "The movie is essentially what has happened to Flint during the 1980s. And despite the harsh reactions to the film, it has managed to pique the interest of others and has been voted the best documentary by the National Board of Review, the New York Film Critics, the Los Angeles Film Critics, and the National Society of Film Critics, as well as best film at the Toronto, Vancouver, and Chicago film festivals." Roger and Me was also included on several critics' opinions as best of the decade lists, but unfortunately conspicuously failed even to be nominated for an Academy Award.
Now, Ida Tarbell was born in 1857 in Pennsylvania, and her father worked in the oil fields down in Pennsylvania. So she had a lot of connection with the oil business. And when the Standard Oil Company decided to buy out her father and take over his company, then then she has a lot of personal experience with the issues of the Standard Oil Company, and that's what she drew upon to write her book, The History of Standard Oil. Now, the history of Standard Oil Company was likely Tarbell's greatest achievement, and it was a 19-part book that was released from 1902 to 1904. Well, it was a mini-series. It was now put into a book, or later on it was, and it's hailed as being one of the most important muckraking pieces in history. It exposes the private and illegal dealings of the Standard Oil Company, such as refusing service to people who would not meet with their demands or their prices. And as the Standard Oil Company basically had monopoly on the oil business, as they'd buy out any other smaller corporations or just bully them out of business, then she exposed a lot of their illegal dealings such as that. And it was collected through years of research that she did after college. Now, her work, as I said, was hailed as one of the most important muckraking works in history, and it is an essential, according to some people, if you're going into any sort of business, in any sort of the business industry. Now, her work got recognized by many important figures, including those in politics, and she was offered a lot of lead positions as advisors to even the president himself. But she turned it down to continue pursuing the truth of Standard Oil and other monopolies such as this. The work done by Tarbell and other muckrakers like her was highly influential in getting important reforms passed in the early 1900s. This is reflected in people such as Upton Sinclair, whose book The Jungle was the foreground for the FDA. Now, the Standard Oil Company fell apart in 1911 due to political reforms, and it is highly thought of that Ida Tarbell's work with the history of Standard Oil had a large influence on this.
Now let's talk about some similarities and differences between Ida Tarbell and Michael Moore. Both Tarbell and Moore revealed some serious issues with major corporations in their time periods. Both Tarbell and Moore personally experienced these negative effects of the wrongdoings of the major corporations such as Standard Oil and GM.
Now, Standard Oil manipulated their consumers into dealing with their terms, while GM fired people in order to compensate for major losses in sales and to create more jobs in other assembly plants in Brazil and Mexico. Both situations affected the surrounding economies and livelihoods greatly, and in general they were kind of the same, as Standard Oil would take over smaller businesses such as the one that Ida Tarbell's father had, while GM simply outsourced jobs so that there was very little source of income.
Now let's think about this. There was a 70-year gap between these scenarios. So if you think about it, 70 years apart, that's two totally different time periods in which these scenarios were happening. So you can think of how the different public reactions would be, and how the different, I guess you could say, authoritative reactions would be. Authoritative meaning legislative reactions and governmental reactions. Moore's research did not influence any major legislation, while the work of Tarbell heavily influenced the opinions of Standard Oil and trusts. Moore's research was really kind of just an aggravation, so it didn't cause any real legislation to be done. And Tarbell's impact was right around the fall of trusts, whereas outsourcing continues to this day. Our personal opinion of this subject is basically this. It's hard to say whether or not the situation created the biggest impact on history, because they're so evenly matched as to their magnitude. We do, however, know this. Outsourcing and layoffs for economic compensation to corporations is still around and will always be around. Time and time again, you see companies firing people to cover up their mistakes and just gain back the ground that they lost. Moore's Roger and Me, as I said before, was a mere aggravation to the economic decline of corporations like GM or Ford.
Ida Tarbell, however, worked to create a long-lasting ban of monopolies and free markets. And to this day, since 1911, monopolies have been eliminated, and we have thousands of profitable and prosperous free markets, such as companies like BP, who, while they do control a lot of the oil business, they're not a monopoly, and they trade and sell to many nations worldwide. The problem with this is, it's hard to tell if this was all Ida Tarbell's doing, as she came around when the antitrust movement was already going, and the ball had started rolling, and it's hard to tell if this was because of her or if she simply pushed it over the edge.